capability, one can see that this would have a supersonic capability. In other words, have the capability to fly easily faster than the speed of sound, because it had to be able to carry out the air defense capability. It had to carry a wide network of weapons, and also be able to do all of the roles in a single aircraft. I think we've emphasized that before. This then is put out in detail in this document that is submitted at this point in the project process. The retired timescales that are referred to, again, it gives the guidelines to the contracting parties as to when the capability should be delivered, as from required timescales from paragraph 8 and 9. And it also points out that both aircraft should be capable of having a midlife upgrade. Generally speaking, combat aircraft, Chair, have what was termed a midlife upgrade somewhere around about 15 to 20 years into their life, to again see them through to the end. This is normally not a replacement, but is just upgrading. Obviously, if one thinks of new digital and computer systems, you know how fast that, we all know how fast that technology changes. So this was already highlighted at that early stage, that this must have growth potential in the product which was acquired. It then goes on to the numbers and the type of flying hours that the system would be prepared to carry out in some detail, and also the fact that these aircraft would need to be deployable and deployed, and give some indication of that. I will not allude further to all the detail herein, other than to say that it is, the point is to make that this is already a comprehensive requirement that is put down by an Air Force or an arm of service prior to the process beginning of the project itself. Chair.
I see it was approved by various persons, including the minister himself. Am I correct?
Yes, sir. This document, staff targets, or in this case, combined staff target, staff requirement. It is a requirement in the process that it is approved at the highest forum, the Armaments Acquisition Council, chaired by the Minister of Defence.
On page 29 of the bundle, there's a signature by is it W.H. Echter, Chief of the Air Force, as at 23 February 1998. Can you see that?
I can see that, Chair.
He mentions there that the project Ukhozi is an urgent requirement since the life cycle of the Cheetah fleet, in particular the Cheetah dual, I can't see what's said, but cannot be extended cost effectively beyond 2006-7. Can you see that? Is he correct in saying that?
He was correct in saying that. In terms, remember I said he's referring to the Ds at that stage would be cost effective. They could then, in other words, they would then start to be phased out to be replaced by the new requirement from 2008 onwards with the new aircraft, dual aircraft.
Page 30, there's also a comment by the chairman. Page 30, Chair. There's a comment by the chairperson of the Armament Acquisition Control Board. I think it relates to the cost aspects. Can you see that?
I can see that, Chair. Yes, I think it was clear at this point, as alluded to earlier, that the amount of funding available within the capital program of the Department of Defence at that time, there was not adequate funding to meet all of these requirements. And the task of the chairman of this Armament Acquisition Control Board then would have been to who is in control of that budget, at that time was pointing out to higher authority that additional funding outside of that would have to be mustered in order for these programs or these requirements to be met. And that is what the packages were all about in terms of that process. Chair.
On page 31, there are also comments made, I think, by, Steyn, Chairman of the Armaments Commission Control Board. He mentions that neither this three-tier nor the anticipated alternative two-tier system can be funded solely from the defense budget. Both the three and two-tier systems are linked to the strategic defense package, for which funding from other sources is required. Is it a fair comment from him?
In my understanding at the time, he was ratifying what the previous chairperson had said. And as the accounting officer of the department at that time, as Secretary of Defense, this would be in his domain to comment and advise accordingly, Chair.
He concludes on paragraph 3, I think, saying that it is further recommended that the Minister of Defense consider soliciting support from Cabinet colleagues for the preferred tier approach. Are you able to elaborate on that comment?
Sir, no. I think as a project officer, I would have presented the document, and these recommendations would have been discussed at the end of that meeting. I believe he's again saying the only way then to find or to solicit those funds for these acquisitions would have to be at a higher level, because he only had a mandate over the funds that were within the capital program at the time. Chair.
Thank you. Over the page, on page 32, we see the signature of the minister, dated 16 March 1998. Am I correct?
Yes, again, sir, at this level, I would not have been present at this point, but what I understand that this then meant that the approval of, at this level, at a ministerial level, is that both projects must be brought in line with the timescales of the STPP program, as they then were from that point on.
Now, maybe we may proceed further then to look at the combined staff target and staff requirement on page 50 of the bundle in respect of the Winchester project. You were responsible for this project also?
That is correct, Chair.
I take it that the document also, the staff target and staff requirement document, traverses over some of the issues that you've already alluded to. Can you, without repetition, take us through the document?
Yes, Chairperson, I can allude to some points without, I think, duplication. I think paragraph 2 of the introduction, just to say again that the Impala Mark II in the past also fulfilled an operational role as a light fighter with distinction up to 1986, after which its operational capabilities regressed, or I explained became difficult to operate in the environment, also due to age, lack of performance, and high threat targets and system unreliability. And then once we, sorry.
Which page are you reading?
I am now reading, sir, from page 52, sorry. Page 52, sir. Proceed, Chair. Thank you. In paragraph 3, it also alludes to the number that I did explain earlier, the 24 leader fighting trainer that were required. And in paragraph 4, it was confirming that this would be within a 3-tier training philosophy. By this time, we knew that the Astra system or Pilatus PC-7 system had already been flying and trained some of our graduates, and we were very comfortable that it confirmed that the Astra did that job very well, and that it gave a good foundation for recruits to come from that onto a typical lead-in fighter type training to transit to the light fighter. I can allude in paragraph 8 just very briefly that during the options study that we looked at, and also you'll see that during the project process the team were also asked to look at certain options of training outside of the country. We also looked at extensions of other aircraft. We also looked at leasing and various other options that were done. So just to make the point that the requirement at this stage had looked at, before this, some work had been done around various of those options, and finally then the decision was that it was required to then acquire a system for that task. In paragraph 11 on page 51, sorry, on page 53, we speak a little bit more around the 3-tier system. Perhaps it's just good to elude what was the thinking at the time. We say this proven process has achieved an extremely high success rate in fighter line, ensuring that fighter aircrew become operational within a single operational conversion course, meaning that by having this system, we would only need a short conversion from a lead-in trainer fighter to in this case, the advanced light fighter. This means you are minimizing the time on the higher cost platform and also making sure that the graduate has been exposed to all types of combat and fighter flying prior to putting him in the cockpit on the frontline fighter. It also facilitated rapid transition to operational status on that aircraft, because it was now a matter of just learning the more complex systems. They would have been well trained on the lead-in fighter program, and is also universal practice by most air forces worldwide who maintain such a modern combat capability. Also alluded to in on page 54 in paragraph 12, where it says the fact that actual weapons delivery is an essential requirement, emphasis on the need for a lead-in fighter trainer, which the Astra at that stage did not have. Also, the flight and maneuver envelope, specifically max speed and engine handling limitation, lack of stores carrying, restricts the application of the Astra for basic weapons and what is termed air combat maneuvering training category, without seriously impacting on structural design life and resultant life expectancy. So just to make the point that if you do try to use an aircraft that is not designed for that task, you will pay a penalty in the life of that aircraft system as well, because you are using it outside of its intended design envelope. If we could go then to page 55, Chair. I think just to give the Commission a sort of feeling, if I may say, for the type of not only air training but sort of ground training that a fighter pilot needs. He needs to also understand theoretical basic aspects which he will utilize in the air of what we term weapons effort planning. This is how you match the right weapons with the right aircraft, how many bombs, how many rounds, etc. you carry. I've mentioned electronic warfare before. squadron management, flight leadership, deployment doctrines, and modern combat and tactics that need to be taught and then applied practically during at least one cycle of mission training. So once you've trained this fighter pilot on his lead-in fighter trainer course, after that, what we do in the Air Force is we will consolidate him in that area. Why? Because on his course he learns to fly the aircraft. But he has to go and fly in complex operations as what we term a wingman first, before he can become a leader. So he will fly as a number 2 or a number 3 or a number 4 in a combat formation under an experienced leader for about a year or so. Again, as I spoke about, learning and growing these skills. And ideally, you do this then on your lead-in fighter trainer because you have the 2-seater aircraft. It is also more cost-effective to establish this training under a slightly more benign situation than what you would have you had sent him straight to the frontline fighter. He would also in this time do some exercises with the Navy and the Army, doing what we call cooperation exercises. He would also deploy to other airfields and other places. He would go on camps and go away from home and operate there, either independently in his own cockpit or with maybe 2 aircraft or 4 aircraft. And so what I'm trying to allude to the Commission is just to explain that this is all the growing path that happens within this lead-in fighter trainer system. And so we state that up front so that that requirement is adequately met later down in the program. So once having then gained, we believe, and our policy in the Air Force has always been in the fighter line, that we want the member who goes to the frontline squadron to be a flight leader. That means that he has the capability to lead a 2-ship formation of aircraft into combat. He must be able to then take a younger pilot, who's his wingman now, and lead him in all aspects of combat flying. Again, an important stepping stone. So by the time he gets to the frontline squadron on the Alpha, in our case now from the Hawk to the Gripen, he is already a flight leader. And then you have a formidable asset that you put in the cockpit with your aircraft, and from there on, at that high cost and high demand aircraft, you have an experienced fighter pilot ready to do the task at the top level.
Does age play any role in respect of when you put a pilot in a Gripen or in a Hawk?
It does not play a role because, well, it eventually will play a role, yes. This is not a game. This is a game for the young men in the Air Force in terms of getting the initial training. But if I look at myself, that first went to become an instructor, I started my combat training at the age of 26, 27. But if I hadn't have done that, I would have started my Mirage course at the age of around about 22, 23. In those days, with those stepping stones around there. Nowadays, we've extended the initial training a little bit and some of the degree training, etc. So in general, you will find that the average combat fighter pilot coming from the Astra Wings course onto the Hawk varies between the age of around 22 to about 24, 25 years of age, and then moves on to the Gripen, probably from about 26 through to, that can go through to about 30, 32 years of age. In the event that he's gone and done his instructor's course early. All combat pilots eventually will go do instructor's course back on the Astra to become pilot attack instructors, because obviously you also need to train your own instructors who you need to bring back then after their operational tour. They then go and become instructors, come back and instruct again on your lead-in fighter trainer, and then instruct back on your frontline fighter. So that's more or less, so I wouldn't say that it is restricted by age, but you want to get him onto these aircraft at not too old an age to obviously get the return. But in my case then, I'd done my instructor's course and then I had a full tour through the line. So by the time I left the cockpit at around the age of 42, which is about the average age 42 to 45, where a combat pilot will then, if he's staying in the Air Force for a career, will be withdrawn to carry on with staff duties. I have one pilot currently flying Hawk who's 58. He doesn't fly all the spectrum, but he's very experienced, and he does some of the more benign jet conversion onto Hawk, just to show that it doesn't mean that you have to stop. You can carry on. But as average, I would say mid-40s to late 40s would be the limit of a fully fledged operational pilot on Gripen. Chair.
Thank you. You may proceed to take us through the document.
And I think a point that's made on that same page of page 55 in 19 is also quite important. It says the added advantage of the lift system, or leading fighter, is that it affords the SAF the flexibility and safety gap to meet the needs of the fast tracker and yet accommodate the average student without the risk of too early an exposure to very expensive and strategic equipment. In flying, there is a term that's called a 2%er. These are basically men and women who were born to put an aeroplane under their seat and fly. I think it probably happens in all sports areas, racing drivers and similar type of careers, and everywhere. The other 98, of which I certainly was part, work hard to become fighter pilots, and there will always be varying degrees of the rate at which you go through. So some might get there younger than others. Others might have to go and fly longer on the lead-in fighter because you get selected to go to the top range. You have to prove yourself, not only in terms of your flying skill, also in terms of your ground skills and your attitude. All of that is important before you get onto the Alpha. And so you find that the advantage here is you have more flexibility to accommodate a wide range of trainees through the system who then eventually will get at a point in time to your frontline fighter. Chair. From that point on, Chair, I think again it was the more detail of all the requirements that would go over to the contracting phase in terms of contract specification and a lot more detail in the latter part of that document, Chair.
The required capability that is expressed in this document would be similar to the capability required by the force design.
If I understand the question correctly, in terms of numbers, remember I said that the numbers would be determined by the amount of people that needed to be trained. And this aircraft would primarily be a training aircraft, lead-in fighter trainer aircraft, but as I alluded to, would, depending on its final capability and the aircraft that you acquire, would have varying degrees of what we term collateral operational capability as a light attack aircraft or light fighter aircraft. And as we heard earlier, there was in the force design a requirement for a light fighter squadron, which alluded to the fact of a need for a light fighter as well, with the sort of capability that could be achieved, yes. If that answers the question, Chair.
If we proceed to page 73 of the bundle, there is a comment made by General Lechter, who was the then Chief of the Air Force. He says that the project Winchester is an urgent requirement since the life cycle of the Impala fleet cannot be extended cost-effectively any longer. Do you agree with that comment?
Chair, I agree.
And on page 75, I think Mr. Steyn again repeats what he has stated in the previous document in respect of Project Tukosi, raising issues relating to the costs. Am I correct?
That is correct, Chair.
Over the page on page 76, the comments made by the then Minister Modise, he says there that the project team must consider the leasing of the above-mentioned aircrafts as an option before any final recommendations are to be forwarded to the AAC for approval. Then Project Winchester must be brought in line together with Project Ukosi with the SDP timescales. Can you see that? What's your comment on?
That was correct, and that option was looked at previously, but again was sent out as part of the later process and replied to by the various contenders. As turned out, none of them were able to submit an acceptable leasing option, and also the how can I say, the pros and cons of leasing, which were weighed up during that period of time, then ended up not taking that route, but acquiring the aircraft. Chair.
And over the page, on page 77, General Ferreira also makes his comment that the project is approved in principle, the aircraft numbers to be determined by the finally approved force design. Can you comment on that?
Yes, Chair. I think previous speakers have alluded to the role of our joint operations. They are the organization within the SANDF which employ aircraft operationally. And so all our project documentation also goes through the board at Joint Ops. This is to make sure that Joint Ops take cognizance of the requirement, and they actually then concur with that requirement as custodians of your capability for Chief of the SANDF. And so he is saying here that that is approved in principle, and that, as was alluded to, numbers were being debated. And I think what he was again cautioning is that it would not necessarily be the numbers in the force design. And this is within his, what I understood, I am not an expert on this, but this would have been very much in his domain to make this comment. He would not have commented on, for example, funding. He would not have commented on the number of training aircraft in terms of detail. But he's saying, I concur that this is an appropriate comment from that organization within the SANDF, Chair.
Now, both these documents, they refer to the Alpha and the Lift without mentioning the type of aircraft. Why is that case?
At this stage of the project, there is no mention of which aircraft could even possibly, in terms of type or name, meet the requirement. This is only the Air Force's stated requirement for the capability. It is not the task then of the Air Force to make those decisions. That would then move to the project phase, which would be done under our Director of Air Force Acquisition and his counterpart in Arms Corps, and the process that would run from that point onwards, Chair.
Am I correct to say then that your role as the South African Air Force would then end with the submission of these documents to AMSCO?
My colleague from Captain Jordan will explain this in much more detail and in much clearer, being the expert in this field. But as a project officer, I think I can explain. The Air Force never leaves the project. It's not a matter of only one or the other. It's a process in which different role players play the dominant role throughout this 10 to 15 years. At this phase, the end user, being the Air Force, would play the dominant role in clearly stating its operational requirement for the next dominant party to receive, once approved by the Minister, and that would in this case be Arms Corps, with the user requirement statement, which is just an engineering document version of this, and they would then convert this into contractual language. And Chair, I'd like to end there in terms of that because, as I said, Captain Jordan will explain that process in detail during his testimony. But again, I say, at no point does either the Air Force during that phase or the DoD project members or the Arms Corps side and many other organizations leave the project. It's so complex, as you've seen, and delivering many requirements and situations that everyone plays a role throughout. But yes, at times there's a lead or a dominant party is the best way I would explain it in my understanding, Chair.
So if we go back then to page 5 of your statement, paragraph 29, you mentioned that the project processes were carried out for the Alpha and Lift, and the Gripen and Hawk were selected in November 1998 by the government as the preferred bidder solution to satisfy the South African combat system requirements. And then after a year of contract negotiations, the Gripen and Hawk contracts were signed in December 1999. You were involved throughout in your capacity as the project leader in respect of Ukhozi and Winchester?
That is correct. I was the Department of Defense project officer with my counterpart who would have been the Arms Corps program manager, Chair.
Paragraph 30, then you refer to the sections of the Joint Investigating Team report, which covers the period of your involvement from February 1998 till the contract signature in December 1999. Do you want to take us through the important elements or points in the Joint Investigating Report in respect of your involvement? That is on page 92 of the bundle, Chairperson. Can you just mention the necessary portions and not everything? Thank you, Chair.
Yes, Chair, I can speak to the process of the Joint Investigation Team report regarding background and up to the submission of the staff target. At that point,
Before you go through the document, the Joint Investigation Report, what is it?
In 2000, a joint investigating team from the Public Protector, Auditor General, and Special Investigations Unit carried out a investigation into the SDPs, and this was their final report, which was tabled at the completion of that investigation and covered various aspects of that phase of the program between the beginning of the background through to that point in time of the contracting. And this chapter referred to here was selection of the Alpha and Lift Prime contractors in that process. Chair.
Yes. Were you involved in the joint investigating inquiry? Or?
I was part of the. I wasn't part of the team. I was engaged on during that process, Chair.
So you can speak directly to the issues that are reflected in Chapter 4 of the JT report.
Yes, of those that I've tabled here, as I said, where my role was the lead role up to the submission of the staff requirement. Arms Corps will speak later and be testifying later to the process that fell in that domain of the remainder of that part of the project, Chair.
Thank you, General. You may proceed to take us through the document.
Thanks. I think on page 92 it confirms all that I have spoken about so far in terms of the background leading up to the various requirements. And then on page 93 it again refers to the staff requirement, which we tabled as the DOD, about the advanced fighter trainer aircraft. It also goes on then to speak about the responses that were received from various of the aircraft that was now for the advanced fighter trainer phase, which was before I joined the team, but it does outlay it as background to the chapter on the leading fighter, the advanced light fighter. You see, I mentioned the F-16 earlier as a similar type of aircraft. The Gripen was also there, and various other aircraft that were looked at. This was that process I spoke about earlier, looking at all the various advanced fighter training type of aircraft. And when those replies came in, the results, which were based mainly on technical performance, were then presented, and as happens in all of these requests for information, one must remember that this is at an early stage, and as I said, the detail of these phases will be alluded to by my colleagues that will still testify in detail. But I think what is interesting is that you can see that this was not a short list of contenders. There were a number of them that replied at the request for information stage for this advanced fighter trainer system. It then briefly also reviewed the process that I have covered in quite a lot of detail between 1996 through to 1998. It also explains how the short list was reduced, which is standard in all programs, because you don't want to go out on further in a program if you can reduce the number of contenders at an early stage, and that is one of the purposes of this part of the program. On page 96, it came to some conclusions in March 1997, and this was more or less at the same time that the various defense packages were being introduced into the system and were being offered to the government on government-to-government processes. I cannot speak as an expert on that because I was not involved in that part. I was at this stage, if you remember, at operational plans, looking at the various options for the fighter master plan.
On page 96, we know that there's a lot of criticism in respect of the acquisition of the Hawk and the Gripen in other quarters. For instance, if you look at the second block on under 4.1.12, the Hawk 100 is reflected as not satisfying the South African Air Force operational requirement and also the issue of the high cost, and the Gripen is indicated as unaffordable. Are you able to comment on this?
Yes, I think one must be, it's very easy to get confused between the aft requirement and the future medium fighter requirement. This meant that the advanced fighter trainer requirement, if you remember, would have been below the level of the future medium fighter. And many of, certainly what I have read so far, seems to sometimes mix the aft frontline medium fighter requirement, in which certainly these aircraft would not have met that requirement because it was not in that class, versus the requirement then for the aft over here, and then later the alpha or the leading fighter trainer. So hence you will find documentation where the service and comments were made regarding the suitability of offered packages versus the normal process. And as it turned out, the normal process was followed in terms of the acquisition process to go through all of these various phases of the program. I'm not sure if that answers the question. So the criticism at that time was for where the Air Force alluded to the fact that it did not meet, in other words, the Gripen would not meet, was not a medium fighter, it was a light fighter. The Hawk would not have met the advanced fighter trainer because it had to have a full light fighter capability as well at that point, similar to other aircraft in its class. I can't comment on the affordability statements here because I was not part, remember, of the aft team of that evaluation or that visit. But I would imagine at that point in time, the aircraft, certainly the Gripen, would have still been in fairly early stages of its development, in which case very little, it was quite early in its life, versus some of the other aircraft that would have had a lot of proven figures in terms of operating and cost that could be put on the table. So that's the only perhaps comment I could make around that. The AT2000, for example, was still a paper aeroplane. It was a paper that was on. It was an aircraft that was still to be developed from start. So that is how wide the Air Force or the project team went out to look, and also to investigate at this point what sort of aircraft were out there and how suitable would they be to meet the requirements of the various tiers and requirements as put out for the advanced fighter trainer. Chair.
Thank you, General. You may then proceed to take us through the document.
I think at the bottom of page 97 was a comment about the packages again, and the fact that at that early stage then there were comments, as I alluded to now, that the affordability also, I think, was highlighted early, that unless there was going to be a new way of acquiring these systems than the traditional way of the past, then additional funding would need to be found. And so it comments on all of this, as I think all of us have alluded to at the time in terms of the force design and affordability, etc., through that process. And the final decision on page 98, I think, was that in view of, in paragraph 4.1.7, Chair, at the bottom, it says, in view of the above, a decision was made by the UCC. That was the one. In those days, we had a project control council, which was chaired by, again, members from all the organizations, and the projects reported to those boards in 17 March 1997 to recommend to the ASB that the project be delayed by 12 months. The reason for that delay was a submission was accordingly made, and it was approved at that ASB. Again, because the packages were just started to be spoken about and were emerging. At the same time, the Air Force requirement was in for to be satisfied, and therefore the AASB thought it prudent to slow down, reconsider, make sure, in my interpretation, as I understand it here, and from what I was informed at plans-wise, was to give time for us to get a better, or the government and the department to get a better understanding of the packages, and then to proceed once that was clarified. And then over to the next part speaks about the requirements of the 2-tier, 3-tier, which I think I have covered in detail, Chair, and it basically confirms what was said, and the roles that these aircraft would play in the process.
At page 99, paragraph 4.2.1, the last sentence says the South African Air Force was therefore forced to redesign in terms of costs and not according to its requirements. Can you comment on it?
Yes, that was the lowering of sights alluded to earlier from the future medium fighter to the advanced light fighter. In other words, we would not be able to afford a medium fighter any longer. And I think it then goes on to the tiers which introduced the lead-in fighter trainer as the middle system in the new fighter strategy or fighter master plan.
And I think critics make mention of the fact that this 3-tier system was so expensive in that it took almost half of the amount budgeted for the whole SDP process. Is that correct?
Sorry, can you repeat the question?
My question is that the critics are saying that by moving to the three-tier system, you basically, as the Air Force, took almost half of the whole package, or the amount of the SDP budget.
Clearly, by going to a three-tier system, you would have an additional system to acquire. I mean, that speaks for itself. Over life cycle cost, one would have to, of course, weigh that off against the higher cost of the more expensive platform to carry out all the training that I've alluded to in a three-tier system. So yes, in terms of acquisition cost, it is certainly a lot more expensive to acquire a three-tier than to have acquired the two-tier. But then one would have to look at, if you looked over life cycle cost of 40 to 50 years of operating those systems at various operating cost levels, then these are studies that were carried out and done at the time throughout and would continue to be done through the project process as well. But as it turned out, obviously then the fighter component chair of the SDPs was a large part thereof, together of course with the submarines and the corvettes and their light utility helicopters, did form a large part of the acquisition costs, yes, by having the three-tier system.
What would have been our financial exposure had we gone for the Eurofighter, which was a medium fighter?
That was the medium fighter vision that had to be lowered. In general, I would say probably you would be looking at acquisition costs of at least double for that system, and operating costs more or less in the same bracket versus the light fighter.
Can you give example of countries who have gone for the Eurofighter on a two-tier system, and what are the cost effects of it?
I don't know of any European country that has taken the Eurofighter on a two-tier system. They all have a three-tier system if they've gone for that level, which is now above the level even of a Gripen. Currently, the Eurofighter was built and was a project by a number of European countries who were actively involved in the aircraft. And I don't know the exact number of countries, but currently about 8 countries have acquired the Eurofighter, of which about 4 or 5 were involved in the program from the beginning, and mainly in Europe. And then also the Eurofighter is the down selection in India currently with the Rafale, and it is also in a number of other down selections at the moment for some other countries. Saudi Arabia has also bought the Eurofighter, as well as I think that's my knowledge on the Eurofighter. It's certainly not accurate, but what I'm saying is a number of countries have bought the Eurofighter. There are also a number of countries that use lead-in fighter trainers in the bracket of the Hawk, for example, to convert pilots onto even the Eurofighter, for example. There are some examples of that, yes. Chair.
Can you then proceed then to take us through the document, General?
Page 99, Chair, they again refer to the staff target and staff requirement updates, which I attached, and I took the Chair through those documents, the Commission. On page 100 was the request for information phase. This is a phase which is again led by Arms Corps and starts to feed into the process on the Alpha. And so I attached this due to the fact that again, just to give an idea at this stage of the sort of aircraft that were replied to on the Alpha request for information. And then out of that, the down selection for what is termed the RFO stage, or request for offer, the down selection out of these aircraft was then progressed through to the final three, which was the AT2000, the Mirage 2000, and the Saab Gripen, which would go out on request for offer, through the project process. It also refers in paragraph on page 100, Chair, in paragraph 4.3.1.3, that it was also decided, and again it just alludes to what we spoke about earlier about the change in numbers, that the initial requirement from 48 came down at a stage to 38 at the RFI stage, and again came down to 28 to fit within prudent cost constraints by the time we got to the RFO stage. Hence my reference to those in my domain as part again of the change to the requirements. And then on page 101, in paragraph 4.3.1.4, perhaps just to allude again to the last phase before the italics, as a result of this presentation, 4 significant decisions were taken. The SAF required both a lift and alpha, a 3-tier system, which is in the domain that I have spoken to. Both would be satisfied through the government STPs, as was in the staff requirement approval. And the lift constituted an additional requirement that had to be registered as such. And the lift was the more urgent requirement that had to be satisfied first, because the Impalas could only fly to 2003, and then there was a little bit more time to replace the Alphas due to the fact that the Cheetahs could fly a little bit longer, is my area of expertise I can speak to on that page, Chair. Out of that then, the request for offer on page 102, they then went over to speak about the request for offer, as I said, which was shortlisted above of the 3 aircraft. And at that point in time, it gave a very brief summary of how the project team viewed the products at this stage. Bear in mind that at this stage there's no commitments, there's no contractual commitments yet, it's purely an information stage. The most important phase then commences, and this is then again in the Arms Corps domain, is the request for offer, which would then go out from that point onwards. And then from there, the bids would have come back and have gone through the value system evaluation and contracting phase, which will be alluded to in more detail by my Arms Corps colleagues as the lead, or the dominant party or lead party for that phase of the project. And that ends the reference to the joint investigation team from my domain and understanding, Chair.
During this project phase, General, there's been a lot of criticism in respect of why the Armaghi from Italy was not preferred, but rather the Hawk. Are you able to comment on that?
I'm not sure regarding the scope of the so-called criticism on that. I think in terms of the Alpha for the Gripen, it's confirmed that the Gripen was selected. Remember that during the STPs there were distinct areas of contracting and evaluations that took place, being strategic defense packages. There was the military. And in our case, we focused on the technical aspects or the technical evaluation. Then there was the financial, and then there was the national industrial participation, and there was the defense industrial participation. So our remit as the military was the military only, which went about the evaluation and the studies done regarding the aircraft itself, in terms of its performance, logistics, in terms of its the company profile, which is an important part of the evaluation as well, which is chiefly looked at again, which is why you have the joint team. It's looked at mainly by the Arms Corps members. We would look very much at the flying part because we would take part in those part of the evaluations. And so when one puts all of those together, that is the evaluation. And you have a very strict RFO that goes out, and you'll hear a lot more detail about that later. It is very specific. And the replies that come in form the contract baseline. This now is contractually binding on companies as well later in the process. And therefore, you assess each of those as they come in. And when one has completed those assessments, remember that the project team only makes recommendations. We have no approval or no authority. We only take those results, we evaluate them. There's a risk analysis that is done. There is an analysis of that, and that is then presented and recommended to, as you saw, all the various processes and boards up the process. And from my perspective, that's the process I talk about that was followed and was presented then right up to the top level for highest level for approval. And then once that occurred, then we knew which were the products were selected for that program.
And what's your comment on the criticism that the Armaki had met the...
Just from my own understanding, General, as I understood the question was, there's allegations that Bairamaki was a much better equipment than the Gripen. I didn't quite understand what your answer was. How did they, or what was the feeling of the Air Force at that stage, as far as these two aircrafts are concerned, after you had made a technical evaluation? Thank you.
Chair, in terms of the Alpha, the Gripen came first on the, in terms of the military evaluation, the three aircraft that were evaluated, the AT-2000 was at that stage a paper aircraft, which was under development. It scored the highest, the Gripen the second, and the Mirage the third. So in terms of the risk analysis and the final decision taken on the, with cost included, on the Alpha, the Gripen was the top product that was selected. On the lift program, there was, perhaps I can just say that the three aircraft were very similar. They all three would have met the Air Force's requirements. So it was very important, perhaps this is more in line with your question, if I understand it correctly. The Air Force's task at that stage, or the task of the project team, was to ensure that whichever aircraft was down-selected for the RFO process and evaluated would meet the requirement for the Air Force. Other considerations in the package would have then been the other aspects that I alluded to that we were not involved in any way, and of course then would be the strategic decisions taken at the higher forums, higher up the authority chain. In terms of the leading fighter trainer evaluation, there were two classes of aircraft. There was the Air Mackie, which was a lower cost aircraft, but also in terms of its flying performance and capability was of a lower capability. The L159, which came from Aero Vidoki, and the Hawk 100 from BAE Systems were aircraft in a higher flying performance domain or capability. However, when a technical evaluation is done, Chair, many aspects of that aircraft system, as I mentioned earlier, is looked at. Not only the flying performance of the aircraft. There's also logistics, there's engineering, and then there is also what's termed company profile, or the capability of that company to deliver the requirement and sustain it. And so you find then in the evaluation, which again will be alluded to more through the project study by Arms Corps, in summary, those aspects are also looked at. And so you will find then that in this category, on the results of the evaluation as such, the Air Mackie, yes, still was the, in terms of the total evaluation, was the highest, evaluated the highest over the whole spectrum. If one only had to have a look at the flying performance of those aircraft within the evaluation, then the Air Mackie was not the highest. The other two aircraft were of a higher performance category in terms of flying. And that confirmed from the flying evaluation that we did that that was the case. But like I said, in a system of evaluation, many aspects are looked at. If that answers the question, Chair.
So is it correct that what the critic says that the Air Force had preferred the Armaki?
Chair, the Air Force does not have any say in the final decision. The Air Force states its requirement. And as long as that requirement is met by the delivered project, then that is the Air Force's domain. We state the requirement. We do not state which aircraft must be acquired to meet that requirement. The Air Force, as I said, in the staff requirement makes that clear, and then it goes through the rest of the process in order to get to that product that is delivered to meet that requirement. What is very important, and that is the primary task which I would have had as project officer, is to ensure the Chief of the National Defence Force and the Air Force that those products which were forwarded into the process before being evaluated together with the others would meet the requirement of the Air Force in all three cases, because the Air Force is not the body that decides on the product. That is decided by other forums much higher than the Air Force Chair.
Thank you. If you then can move back to your statement on page 5. I think we are now on paragraph 31 of the statement.
But before we go there, let me just get clarity on this. General, I understand quite clearly that all you are interested is a product that meets your requirement. You don't care much about which one is it, as long as it meets your requirements. Is that correct? Commissioner,
yes, that is so. It must meet the minimum requirements which are set by the Air Force in its requirement. If it cannot meet those minimum requirements, you will hear later, if I may just allude a little bit, you also in this requirement, when it gets converted from our requirement into the Arms Corps process, and you will have read about this in the report, we talk about mandatory requirements. They have to be met. If an aircraft is offered and cannot meet certain mandatory requirements that the Air Force can say, we cannot live with not meeting this requirement, then that aircraft will not go through to the final RFO stage. And then after that, there are other requirements in which it could be differences of what's called highly desirable. That will be explained a lot later. The Air Force is as long as the Air Force gets the product as required in the staff requirement, it will continue with that product, sir.
The fact is the Gripen and the Hawks have been chosen and they are delivered. to the Air Force? Do they meet your requirements?
Sir, if you may, I will be alluding to that in my next section under utilization in the Air Force. When we come to that phase, I will explain how we evaluate that to make sure that that happens, Commissioner. If I can do it then, sir. Thank you, Commissioner.
Thank you. General, in paragraph 31, then you are telling us about the time you spent in the United Kingdom, 5 years, at the BAE Systems. And there you are managing and overseeing the various project phases and activities with the BAE System team. This was an everyday kind of a job.
Yes, Chair, once the contracts were signed in December 1999, while the negotiating phase was going on with the preferred bidders during 1999, which again would have been mainly in the domain of Armscor, who are our contracting party and contracting the DoD part of the team, although we partook in that and were actively involved. We would now be concentrating on what is termed the acquisition plan part. In other words, our role of being part of the team during the remainder of the project. And leading up to that, for those few months before we actually launched, is the formulation of a joint project team. At this point, then, I became the project officer for Project Winchester, where I explained we now became two teams, one to go and complete the project to acquire the leading fighter, the Hawk. Another project team was established to do the same in Sweden, to take the project through that phase with the manufacturer in Sweden. And so the planning took place until April 2000, and then we launched overseas with a joint Armscor and DoD project team. And as I said again, what we did in this case is we took the members from the Air Combat Acquisition team and we more or less split them half-half. So we had a balance in this team of the same members who'd come through the process right from the beginning. This is very important on projects because now you have the knowledgeable people who've gone through all of that process for, 2 years already, knowing that product by now very well, and then spending a whole year really getting into the detail, who go over to the original manufacturer and stay on site and make sure then that the product is delivered to the requirement of both the Air Force, and the Armscor team will make sure that it is delivered to specification and within contract baseline, being finances, cost, etc. And this team then operates and forms an integrated project team with the manufacturer to make sure then that the project is successful. I would say that the important role there of the members of the Department of Defense is also to act as the first line of information to assist Armscor to make sure that they also, along this process, fully understand the requirement and also the manufacturer. So if there are questions to be answered, what do you mean by this? How much, to clarify. You have experts from the Air Force there to answer those questions. And that's the role then that we undertook. We also were part of all the safety tree meetings. We were part of the various production meetings. So during this period, you act as the knowledge base on that product at a very detail, from the time the aircraft starts to be produced right through until you have to go back and deliver it to the Air Force, to ensure then that all along the way, if there are any issues, risks or problems not predicted or estimated, as these change, I would then be the conduit through which this would be fed back into the department and into the Defence Force, and particularly back into the Air Force on an ongoing basis, reporting back and ensuring that all along the way the Air Force did not lose touch or were not involved. And I think I alluded to that. However, the lead party again would have been their Armscor, because you're working with the contractors. So we would be in support of Armscor, making sure that they met their mandate of their part of the team work that was done. We were quite a small team, and then from time to time, whilst we were overseas in there, we would bring over specialists from time to time from South Africa who would come on site again in particular areas at particular times. And these were the people then that would come back and further start to educate the Air Force and start to what we call prepare the environment to receive this new equipment. Because remember, it's not it's quite a complex system. And so you can't wait until the aircraft actually arrive and then only start educating the system, because they have to start to prepare all of the environment to receive this new system. So I think in trying to summarize in a nutshell for the Commission, this is the main role of the Department of Defense members in this team that goes on site. And the same was done for all the other projects as well, Chair.
So after spending 5 years, you reckon that you were fully equipped on the system together with your team?
Yes, including the wider team that would come over and get exposure and prepare, Chair.
In paragraph 32, you mentioned that in 2004, the local Hawk implementation team was formed. Was it while you were still in the UK?
Yes, this was still while I was in the United Kingdom, but the first of our members from that team then returned to South Africa. And they started to form what we call the Hawk implementation team. And this is the team that is tasked to prepare the environment to receive the system once it starts to arrive, and also to facilitate the delivery of all the components of the system into the Air Force. They then clearly started to build up other members in South Africa within the Air Force to meet this requirement. So you find that, for example, the officer commanding of the new unit that was to receive the aircraft would have been part of this team. The first instructors and the first ground crew would have been part of this, what we call the implementation team, Chair, so that they can at an early stage, even before the aircraft arrive, they start to go through the documentation. They start to understand this new system that is arriving into the Air Force. And their task is then to make sure that all the facilities are correct to the right specification, so that when the aircraft arrive and you start putting test equipment down or logistics down, that the facilities are ready, and if there's any changes to those, they need to be prepared and also verified as ready. And that then is the Air Force's task to do as well. So again, you find in this phase, the Air Force starts to become more and more an important role player in the project, because they're now starting to receive the equipment and will have to operate the equipment in the next few years in its initial stages. That is what is termed in our part of the program the implementation role and the implementation team that is formed to do this, Chair.
Now, during the 5 years that you have spent in the UK, was the air crew in the form of technicians, engineers, also trained on the system?
Yes. Part of your implementation phase is then also the training, which is contracted and is done by the original equipment manufacturer. In this case, it was BAE Systems, and they would have sent out then their instructors. These are normally ex-Royal Air Force instructors that they employ as test pilots, and they came out and trained our first 6 air crew in South Africa on site once the aircraft arrived in our environment. In some cases, previously, our pilots would have gone overseas to do training there. But in our case here, we did the training here, which actually was an advantage, because it meant we could be trained in the environment where the aircraft would continue to operate. I think on the Hawk. I can just say at this point, I was not part of the Project Ukosi team overseas, but this same process, Chair, was followed for Project Ukosi from the DoD side. They had, and again, their own project officer and members who went over, did exactly the same, also had an implementation team, and then the same process to prepare for receiving the Gripen when they were delivered. The initial some two pilots were trained in Sweden first, and the remainder then were trained in South Africa, for example. So it'll never be exactly the same. But ideally, in my view, is you want as much training to take place on your own base, in your own environment, by your initial instructors. Because, as I said, that is most cost-effective and gives you the most advantage in terms of you then training your further air crew and ground crew. And the same happened with the ground crew. The original manufacturer sends out a team, and they train your ground crew on your equipment and on your system on site. Chair.
Thank you, General. In paragraph 33, you mentioned that the Hawk aircraft were delivered from May 2006 over 12 months, and the Gripens from April 2008 over 12 months. In this respect, you refer to annexure JWB5 and 6, and JWB5 is on page 105. Can you just take us through it? Page 104, 105 of the bundle.
I can allude then to the delivery. This is, as requested, this was the delivery of each tail number of the aircraft over that period. And as it shows there, it proves then that the Hawk aircraft were delivered over 12 months, roughly at 2 aircraft per month. The reason why this could be achieved, Chair, was that one of the successes of I believe, of the Hawk project in terms of the involvement of local industry was that the first Hawk was built on site in the UK fully. And then it was put in a transport aircraft and flown out to South Africa. This aircraft was what we called a flight test instrumented aircraft, which was acquired, and it did some initial flying in South Africa at our test flight center with our test pilots involved, as well as BAE's test pilots involved. And this aircraft, though, was still then under the project phase, still owned by BAE Systems. These aircraft I refer to are the ones which arrived on site at Air Force Base Mikado, delivered to the Air Force. Just to clarify that point, the aircraft, the first aircraft being aircraft 250, which was this flight test instrumented aircraft, and I'll speak a little bit more about that during my utilization part of my statement, Chair. So the other 23 aircraft were built by BAE Systems in the UK up to a certain point where they would have to be assembled. And at that point, all of the parts of the aircraft were shipped out to Denel in Kempton Park, and Denel Aviation did the assembly of all the aircraft in South Africa in our local industry. And out of Denel, the aircraft were then delivered to Air Force Base Mikado. So this gave local industry a large proportion of work, and also allowed them to increase their knowledge base in terms of understanding modern assembly of a modern fighter aircraft system. And therefore, the aircraft were able to be delivered at roughly 2 a month, because if you remember, going back to the staff requirement, we said that these aircraft were quite urgent and we needed them to be delivered quite quickly. So that was the process that happened for the Hawks. In terms of the Gripens, it was slightly different. The Gripen was fully built over in Linköping in Sweden, the main reason being that these were composite aircraft and of a different production type of process, and also that their assembly was much more complex in terms of the final product. And so it was not deemed then cost effective to also assemble them here. So they were fully built in Sweden and then shipped out on aircraft, but over a much longer period They arrived in the country between from April 2008 over about 30-month period by ship, roughly 2 or 3 aircraft at a time. The aircraft were then taken ownership of by the project once they were put on the ship in Sweden, and they were shipped out to South Africa. We put people on the ship to make sure that the aircraft were safe and that the aircraft were looked after while they were on board ship. And when they got to Cape Town Harbour, I'm not sure many people will have seen pictures, but the aircraft were then put down on the quay and actually towed to our Air Force base in Eysterplaat. They were, the wings were assembled and put on by our ground crew, who were trained by SAB at that time, flown by our test pilots one sortie, and then ferried up to Mikado, and that's how the aircraft arrived in Mikado into the environment in which they're operating today. Chair.
The numbering of the Hawks and the Gripens, is there any significance in the numbering?
No. What happens with South African Air Force, there are batches of numbers reserved for new aircraft from way back. And so when your aircraft arrives, if we look at the Mirage F1s, they were also at what we call a 200 series, but only up to below 250. So the next available block of numbers on the data system was from 250 upwards, and so the Hawks became Hawk 250 to Hawk 273, the 24 Hawks. The Gripens had the designation 3901 through to 3925 for their 26, sorry, for their 26 aircraft that were delivered. So no, the numbers do not have any specific significance, Chair.
You say that the South African Air Force took ownership of these Gripens when they were shipped. Was there no risk in doing that, or was there any advantage?
No, the only reason for that, not the Air Force. Remember, the handover from the manufacturer is first to the project team. Then the project is responsible for the aircraft until what we call system handover, which I allude to a little bit later. That is when the Air Force takes ownership of the total system. That's now the aircraft, all the training has been done, all the logistics is delivered, everything is on the ground, has been checked by the Air Force and made sure that this meets all our requirements. It's been tested, and then the Air Force takes system ownership. So at that point in time, the project still owns the assets, not the Air Force yet. Now, had the aircraft that were brought out by ship from Sweden not been taken ownership in Sweden, it would have been very expensive for the manufacturer to insure the aircraft and to transport them. So this was then done under the risk of government. As you know, government does not insure these assets as such. And so when they were coming out here, we put our people on the ship to make sure that those aircraft were safe and were delivered correctly. So that's the only reason why the process happened that way.
So it was a risky but cost-effective measure.
Definitely, and the risk was, because in any case it would have had to be done by the manufacturer anyway. You know, he would have done it, or we did it. So it reduced the cost. The risk would have been the same.
In paragraph 33, you also proceed to say that facilities were prepared, air and ground crews were trained, logistics support was delivered, and the unit commenced with operational test and evaluation, which is the final testing by the end user in the SAF environment with own resources to check that the equipment delivered is fit for purpose and meets the South African Air Force requirements. Can you elaborate on that?
Yes, Chair, when this equipment is delivered and adequate aircraft ground crew are trained by the original manufacturer, the simulators are put in place, the test equipment is in place, then the Air Force in the domain where it flies and is an Air Force responsibility is to carry out what we call operational test and equipment. And then what happens is the squadron or the unit, pilots and ground crew, will go back and make sure that this aircraft meets the requirement in the staff requirement and in the user requirement specification from a Air Force usability perspective. During the project, and that is the responsibility again of the project team, Arms Corps will have done quality assurance control. You'll hear more about this later, all the way through. We would also have done what is called developmental testing, where our test pilots would have been involved with the manufacturer's test pilots to make sure that the aircraft meets the specifications. We don't repeat that now in the Air Force. We take all of those tests that have passed already, and now we subject the system to what we term fit-for-purpose testing in the Air Force. In other words, can the pilots and the ground crew trained, in this case, in my case of the project by BAE Systems and the project, can they fly the aircraft in our environment, in our conditions? Can our ground crew, who've been trained with the equipment they've been given, fix an aeroplane, replace an engine, turn the aircraft around within a certain time? All those requirements that were put in the staff requirement have to be ticked off on what we call a compliance matrix. And once all of those have been ticked off and agreed to, only then does the Air Force accept handover of that system from the project. So there are enormous checks and balances that are put on. The base will exercise that these aircraft can fly so many sorties in a day. They can fly at night and at daytime. Are all the facilities in place? Everything has to be ticked off, not only the responsibility necessarily of the OEM, but the project part, as well as did the Air Force prepare the environment correctly for these aircraft to be able to operate. So I think I want to give the assurance to the Commission that if those aircraft get to that stage and pass the OT&E, it can then be said that these aircraft then meet that requirement. That is what is operational test and evaluation. Currently, the Air Force has taken ownership and handover of the Hawk system into the Air Force. There are some few project deliverables which will still happen. I can give an example of why. The Air Force also, during the project phase, had the logistics approach that unless proven otherwise, the maintenance of the aircraft must be on base, on site. If not, it must be in local industry. And only if it cannot be done cost effectively, that way must the maintenance or the support of the aircraft go back overseas to the original manufacturer. So in that process of delivering all of that capability, some of the deeper level capability for the Hawk is the major service on the Hawk, which is quite a deep level of maintenance, which we can do on the base. And then at another ASU in Pretoria, we are putting down a capability to service the APU on the aircraft. This is the air pneumatic system and pressure system, which is quite a high-cost driver of maintenance on any aircraft. This is what keeps the aircraft running before the engine is started. And we're going to do the deeper level servicing of that. The first one is coming June next year, and so that delivery was delayed by the project to be delivered, specifically so that the putting down of this capability would be at the same time that our technicians needed to do this work. Secondly, by putting it down now, we retain the warranty only once it is in place and accepted by the Air Force. If we had brought this equipment too early, then you will lose the warranty period because you won't do the service. This is giving some idea of how important it is in terms of the delivery, and also why projects take a long time and have quite a long delivery period as well. So this last few pieces will be put down and checked as an entity. But there was adequate proof that the system met the requirement, and the Air Force accepted the system and had it handed over. And Commissioner, that should answer then your question to me on the Hawk. It meets the requirement and is accepted into the Air Force. The Gripen today is still in project phase. It has not been fully handed over to the Air Force today. It has completed, I just want to get to my statement here. It has completed round about 85% of its operational test and evaluation. It still has some to go before the Air Force will fully accept the system. The aircraft, however, has been fully delivered, all 26 aircraft, and the bulk of the deliverables are in place at Mikado. And currently, we have done, as I said, the bulk of the testing, and so far the system has passed the OT&E up to this point in most areas. But I say again, it is not completed yet. This should be completed to take place. The final stage of handover of the Gripen system will be in early 2015. Chair.
Thanks. In paragraph 35, you mentioned that the Gripen is the South African Air Force only full fighter capability, whilst the Hawk is primarily a fighter trainer aircraft, but with a considerable level of collateral operational capability in low threat environments, and has growth in this role when operating in a package together with the Gripen. Can you just elaborate on that statement?
So I think in summary we're saying that we have now or are about to complete the operational test and evaluation and confirm now that that is our only capability and it meets that capability. The Hawk, on the other hand, has been accepted. We understand. We have already trained pilots on the Hawk from the Astra successfully onto the Gripen. So we have proven that the three-tier system, as acquired, meets the requirements of taking a PC-7 Mark II pilot through the Hawk and onto the Gripen. We have already trained some people in that domain, and I'll speak a bit more about that under utilization. And then also, we have seen that the Hawk has a considerable level of what we term the collateral operational capability in lower threat environments. And also, we have found out that matched with the Gripen, due to its higher performance levels and ability to call it in simple terms, keep up better with the Gripen and operate in a similar type of environment, although at lower performance levels, we can utilize the two aircraft together also in this collateral role, meaning that the Gripen can operate with the Hawk in a wider environment than what was anticipated originally. As a summary of how far we have gone with the operational test and evaluation, and I'll speak a little bit more about that in the utilization part. Chair.
And you further mentioned that the Gripen and Hawk aircraft systems have proven to be highly deployable, adaptable, and have the flexibility to satisfy a wide range of air power national security requirements for the Republic. Can you just elaborate?
Yes, I think these modern systems such as these, by comparison with our previous systems, because they were designed much more with engineering and logistics in mind, if we compare them to the Cheetah or the Mirage F1 or the Impalas, they have what we term a far smaller logistics tail. That meaning that when you deploy these aircraft away from base, which you would need to do in operations, you need far less logistical support when they are deployed away from base than we were used to in the past. And I would go so far as to say that this has exceeded our expectations in terms of this deployability. Equally, I cannot say that it's only these platforms. I'm talking about the new capability. Had it been the other capabilities, I imagine similarly if they were newly developed as well. But the mix of these two aircraft in terms of their commonality and operability, not only with each other, but also to be able to deploy, we have found certainly has exceeded expectations, I would say, as a highlight of the capabilities. And as I mentioned earlier, the fighter line does remain, we believe, an important part of our air power national security and can meet various requirements. Also, I think there were a lot of might I say, not critics, but a lot of people said, wow, but you're buying an aeroplane from Sweden, where it snows and it's in the Baltic, and we operate here in hot and high conditions in southern Africa. But we must bear in mind that the Gripen that we acquired was what was termed the export baseline, Chair. In other words, it was not the same aircraft that the Swedish Air Force flew originally. They did fly originally an aircraft that was designed, yes, for Sweden as a step one, which you often find countries do initially. They will first design their aircraft for their own Air Force, because they need that Air Force to prove it first, ideally, before selling it and putting it on the market. But in this case, we then were what was termed the launch customer for the export baseline version. So this aircraft was designed and adapted for worldwide, for example, climate conditions. It was designed to operate hot and high. It was designed to operate in different environments and different deployment areas as well. And also, one must remember, Sweden, coming out of the Cold War, also had to adapt, and they have now converted to this EBS. It's now called the Gripen CD instead of the AB in Sweden. And they have taken their ABs and converted them and upgraded them to CD version, which is also given them their capability. And if you had followed the Libyan conflict, you would have seen that Gripens were deployed by the Swedish Air Force into the Libyan conflict, showing typically again that they had the capability to deploy outside of Sweden as well. And they did so with success. And we have seen as well that the aircraft, we believe, the Gripen, is well suited for the African battle space of the future to support the country as a national asset, Chair.
Now, this Gripen that we have acquired, is it limited to the African battle space or what?
Certainly not. As I alluded to, we also have flown the aircraft in Sweden during the acceptance. Before the aircraft was accepted in Sweden, the test pilots from Saab would have flown it 2 or 3 or 5 times to make sure from the manufacturer that they are happy this airplane has been built and checked out. Then the project test pilots would have flown it, and our test pilots from the Air Force went over to Sweden and did 2 or 3 flights, however necessary, to make sure that before the aircraft were loaded on the ship to come to South Africa, our pilots had flown those aircraft in Sweden to make very sure that everything on the aircraft worked and was correct. And similar processes would have been followed by the on-site team on the ground to make sure of that. So what I'm alluding to is these aircraft have already flown in those type of conditions, and fortunately, because the delivery was over 30 months, it flew there in the middle, really in winter, and in snow, and in quite harsh conditions that our aircrew are not normally exposed to here as well. And then in the Libyan campaign, of course, the Swedes had the opportunity to also fly the aircraft outside of Sweden in that sort of environment. And again, there are other Gripen users currently, which I'll cover in my utilization, that fly the Gripen currently in other parts of the world as well. So I think we can with confidence say that the aircraft, like all fighter aircraft that are offered for sale internationally, need to be able to meet worldwide spec and conditions to operate, Chair. Sorry.
Thank you, Chair. I see it's about 4 o'clock. We are about to move into a new topic. Maybe it's a right time to adjourn.
Thanks a lot. Maybe you are correct. We should adjourn now. And General, we'll see you again tomorrow morning. You have not been excused as yet because we are still proceeding with your evidence tomorrow. Thank you. We'll adjourn.